Chapter 1. London, 1893. What a place, George thought. Greasy, grim, and ripe for murder. It was summer, the night was hot, and the air thick as treacle. Not like England at all, more like being back in India. He turned down a side street, past a couple of dimly lit bars. Shadows huddled in the corners and the doorways, women and sailors and young thugs looking for easy marks. Well, they won't find one here. He followed the sound of coarse laughter. Two men in capes and bowler hats smoked cigars outside a nondescript building with no windows. They looked out of place among this crowd. George knew he had found what he was looking for. He climbed some narrow wooden stairs and went along a short passageway, grimaced as he pushed through the curtain into the gambling room. The taint of fear and sweat mingled with the putrid fug of stale cigar smoke and made the bile rise to the back of his throat. George took his watch from his waistcoat pocket. Just after 2 o'clock in the morning. I should be in my bed. He looked around the room, the moth-eaten red velvet, the fake Vincenzo mirrors, the cigar burns on the scaly Turkish carpets. It looked like the salon in a brothel he had once visited in Alexandria. Now that was an experience he didn't want to be reminded of. There were 4 or 5 tables with various card games in progress. A few of the players glanced up at him briefly and returned their attentions to the cards. Then he saw him, at the far table facing away from the door. They had said he would find him here when he asked at the public house down at the docks. He's always there, that one. Every night. Harry had his waistcoat unbuttoned, his tie loose. He hadn't aged a day since George last saw him, and yet he looked 100 years old. He'd seen that look once before, after giving evidence at a court-martial on the face of a young man who had been sentenced to a firing squad the next day. There were 2 men watching him from the other side of the rope that separated the tables from the rest of the room. One of them had the build of a wrestler and the look of a schoolyard bully, as if he couldn't wait to find someone to pummel. His companion was small and devilishly thin. He reminded George of one of the first cadavers he had seen in medical school, a criminal executed for killing his mother and younger brother with an axe. Could have been the corpse's twin, right down to the slightly bluish death pallor of his skin. The bully's gaze settled on him for a moment, then moved away again, discounting him as a threat. Another degenerate come to lose all his money on the cards or the whores, the look seemed to say. George moved to the side, kept to the back, didn't want Harry to see him just yet. Not much chance of that, he thought. The state he's in, I don't think he'd know his own mother right now. It was late, and most of the players had left the table. Only 3 of them now, just the drunk and the desperate at this time of night. The croupier, he looked half asleep, used a flat wooden spatula to lift the cards across the bays and drop them in front of the other players. George didn't understand much about the game, but by the look on Harry's face, he was losing, and badly. The players faced their cards. The croupier used the rake to push his chips to the right, then to the left. He looked as if he had swallowed cold fat. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a silver cigarette case. His hand shook as he lit a cigarette. Harry stood up and walked out of the room. He moved so quickly that the 2 men who had been watching him through the whole game were caught off guard. They almost fell over each other, going after him, got themselves in a tangle in the red velvet curtain. In other circumstances, it might almost have been funny. George followed the 2 men through the curtain and down the passageway. A man got in his way and he shoved him aside, heard him cursing after him as he ran down the stairs. The street was empty. Yellow light from a single gaslight glimmered on the cobblestones. He heard a commotion down one of the alleys and he ran towards it, his Malacca cane with its rubber tip bouncing on the cobbles. He saw shadowy figures in the alley. It looked like Harry had walked, or run, into a trap. 2 men were at the far end of the alley, blocking his escape. Bully Boy and his cadaverous friend from the gambling club had followed him from the club and now had him backed against the wall. Bully Boy produced a wooden club, which he slapped against the palm of his left hand. "What's the hurry, me old China?" he said to Harry. "Forgot to feed my cat," Harry said. George smiled. Penury hasn't taken away his sense of humour. A good sign. It looked as if Harry thought he could fight his way out of this. He ran straight at the big fellow, took a swing, and missed, which allowed the smaller man to grab him from behind. He put one arm around Harry's neck and jerked him backwards, off balance. The two men who had been guarding the end of the alley ran up to help them. They each grabbed an arm and forced Harry against the wall. They held him there while the thin one started beating him, slowly and methodically, with his fists. He took his time between punches, picking his spot. The first punch went into Harry's ribs, bending him double, making it easier for the second blow to land on his nose. Harry didn't make a sound. There was no pleading, no yelling. George could imagine him thinking that he wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Already there was blood streaming from his right eye and his nose. Harry would only really be upset if they broke any teeth. He had always been quite vain about his looks. "Gentlemen, I think you should stop right there," George said. The thin man turned around. He looked over George's shoulder to see if he had any friends with him, and when he realized he was alone, he said something to the others, and they all laughed. They took in his clothes, the evening dress, the polished shoes, the silk bowler, the Malacca cane, and concluded that he was a fop and therefore harmless. The big fellow said, "You should do well to stay out of this, matey." George took a step forward. A casual flick of the wrist expelled the rubber tip of the cane, and even in the dull glimmer of the gaslight, the glint of steel at its tip seemed to make an impression. The thin one changed his tune. "Who the fuck are you?" he said. George didn't have a Victoria Cross, like Harry. He was more accustomed to cleaning wounds than causing them, but he had been around long enough to know what a man had to do in a street fight. It was all about speed and aggression, not standing around gawping like these fine fellows. One quick sweep of the cane and the thin one squealed and reeled back, clutching at his face. Blood spurted through his fingers. While the others stared at this in shock, George flicked his wrist a second time, and Bully Boy gasped and looked down in horror at the slash on his arm. The blade had gone right through the sleeve of his coat. He found he no longer had the strength to hold the billy club. It clattered onto the ground. The tendon I have just bisected is crucial for movement. Its Latin name is flexor carpi ulnaris. You need use of it in order to flex your hand and hold things, such as the weapon you just dropped on the cobblestones there. I'm afraid it will take rather a long time to heal. Would you like another anatomy lesson? An incision to your patella ligament should be most instructive. The big man turned and ran away down the alley, clutching his arm. He would be no more trouble. The two toughs holding Harry for the beating decided that whoever was paying them for their trouble was not paying them nearly enough. They ran off. Without them holding him upright, Harry sagged against the wall and sat down onto his haunches. The thin man was still clutching at his face with his left hand. He fell to his knees and scrambled for the billy club with his other hand. George stood on his fingers and he squealed in pain and panic. George put the blade of the cane tip at his throat. "I am being impolite. A few moments ago you asked me who I am. I'll tell you who I am. I'm the man who will take out both your eyes with one flick of his wrist and present them to your wife as earrings if you don't let go of that club." He did as he was told. Blood dripped down his arm and onto his coat. With his one good eye, he looked around for his associates. They were long gone. George kept the point of the blade pressed into the thin man's cheek, just below the eye. "I'm going to bleed to death here." "It's all the same to me," George said. "Do as you like." He nodded towards Harry. "Do you know who this man is?" "He's a drunk who doesn't pay his gambling debts." "This is Captain Harry Delhaze of the Royal Horse Artillery." He was awarded the Victoria Cross for bravery at the Battle of Tel el-Kebir. I don't care who he is. He should pay his debts. How much does he owe? £15, 10 shillings. £15? You would do a man serious injury for 2 months' rent. What kind of a cockroach would earn his living that way? He looked at Harry, who had struggled back to his feet. Harry, these gentlemen appear to have dropped something. Harry grunted and picked up the billy club. George put the cane under his arm, took out his wallet, and dropped some notes onto the ground by the thin man's feet. Take your money and go. The man crumpled the notes in his fist and put them in his pocket. He stumbled away, still clutching his face. We should get out of here. Are you ready? I'll just be a moment. I have to rearrange my nose. Your nose is fine. Let's get going. Harry seemed to be having some trouble walking and breathing. George couldn't really see the extent of the damage in the dark, and there wasn't much he could do about it here, even if he could. George, what are you doing here? This is a conversation for later. First, we have to get you home. Do you live far? Just a short and pleasant stroll. He took a step and stumbled. George put an arm around him. Come on, he said. They reached Waterloo Bridge, and George searched for a hansom cab. He propped Harry against the wall, took out his cigarette case, lit 2 cigarettes, and put one between his friend's teeth. Been a long time, Harry said. 4 years. Your appearance was opportune. He coughed and spat blood onto the pavement. I think the bastards broke my ribs. You were lucky that's all they broke. Are you going to tell me what you're doing here? First, let's get you home. I don't think we're going to find a cab. We'll walk. You can manage? I'm a war hero. No, you're lucky. They're 2 different things. He put a cigarette in his mouth and leaned Harry's weight on his shoulder. Okay, show me the way. It was not the kind of place to wander about at night, with its darkened doorways and piss-smelling alleys. The miasma that rose from the sewer grates caught the breath. George held his cane ready as Harry directed him to an anonymous doorway. There was not a light burning anywhere, and they had to stumble up a narrow staircase in the dark. Harry fell over twice, smashing his shins on the edge of the stair. He fumbled with his keys and finally got them inside. The first thing George noticed was the smell of stale tobacco and rising damp. There was no electric light. Harry had to grope around in the dark to find the gas lamp. Harry pointed to the bedroom, and George half carried him in and threw him on the bed. He was snoring even before George got his boots off. He threw a blanket over him and debated whether to go back to his hotel or sleep on the chaise longue. He decided to stay. Harry would need fixing up, and besides, if he left him alone for even an hour, there was no telling the trouble the bastard could get into. George shut the bedroom door and looked around. What a mess. There were dirty plates piled on the floor, a mountain of cigarette stubs in a cheap tin ashtray, a painting of a naked harem girl above the mantel. A piece of the plaster ceiling had come down and was propped against the wall. He went into the kitchen to look for coffee. The bread and milk were on the bench by the window. The bread was covered in mould. The milk was soured. It was all there was. George went back into the living room, found a blanket in a cupboard. He would have to use his coat for a pillow. He was about to turn out the gaslight when he saw some framed photographs on the mantel and went over to take a closer look. There was a solemn family group in the garden of their house in Devon, another of Harry as a teenager with his brother and parents climbing in Wales. George was surprised to find a miniature of Harry's father, looking suitably stern in his goatee beard and pince-nez. He turned out the light and curled up on the chaise longue, wondered about the man snoring to wake the dead in the bedroom. How had he fallen this far? He had so envied him when they had been at school and had tried to emulate him at military college. How could Harry have allowed this to happen to himself? If his creditors didn't kill him, then he'd die of the cold before the winter was over. It was not the most uncomfortable night's sleep he had ever had. That would be the night he had spent sleeping in a trench being eaten alive by sandflies in Egypt. He finally dropped off to sleep, only to be woken a little while later by the horn blasts of an early morning tramway car. Chapter 2. Harry woke with a start. He sat up, gasped with pain. It all came back to him in a rush. Another bad night at the tables, the men trapping him in the alley, giving him a good beating. A miracle if they hadn't broken half his ribs. He felt around his mouth for his teeth with his tongue. It seemed like they were all still there. Well, that was unexpected. The old Delhayes luck still holds, he thought. He went to the window, saw a man down in the street turning off the gas lights. At 7, the organ grinder started his rounds, a little capuchin monkey tied to a string, gibbering and shrieking. Trying to get away from the noise, he supposed. For God's sake, Harry thought. What I wouldn't give to be back in the army. I'd shoot the bastard. George put his head around the door. So, you're awake? George, it is you. I didn't dream it. You look like hell. Thanks. Let me have a look at you. Get your clothes off. He did as he was told. The shirt was ruined. The laundry would never get the bloodstains out. His suit was covered in filth from the alley. George came back in with a flannel and an enamel bowl of cold water. He bent down, looked in his mouth. Well, your teeth are all still there, though a couple of the molars are loose. Your lips split, but at least your jaw's not displaced. He wiped the blood off his face, held up 3 fingers. How many fingers? 29. Close enough? There were bruises on his ribs, both sides, already turning blue. How do you feel? It hurts to cough. Don't cough. It hurts to breathe. Don't breathe, then. It's your choice. Perhaps next time pay your debts. That's your professional opinion. That will cost you more. What about my nose? Is it broken? Yes, but not badly. It's bent at rather a dashing angle. Once the swelling has gone down, it will give your boyish good looks a rougher edge, like someone who actually looks like they deserve a medal. Could you straighten it? I could if I had my equipment with me. Or you could go to the hospital. Is it going to hurt? Oh, yes, quite a lot. Well, let's not bother. What do you think, Doctor? Will I live or die? It depends. Depends? It depends on whether you give up playing cards. How many other gentlemen do you owe money to? Few. I wouldn't call any of them gentlemen. Then I'd say the prognosis isn't good. You were lucky this time. Your ribs will hurt like hell for a while, but then you should be fine. If I hadn't come along when I did, the beating would have been much worse. They were the sort of men anyone with good sense would try to avoid. It was only a few pounds. I was going to pay them back. How? Do you have a job, Harry? You sound like my father. I feel like your father, God help him. Come on, get dressed. I'll buy you some breakfast and we can drop by my hotel afterwards and get that cut over your eye fixed up. You still haven't told me what you're doing here. Last I heard of you, you were headed home to deliver babies and treat little children with measles. You didn't just stumble into the gambling hall last night, did you? Not your kind of place at all. And you're a long way from home. You're right, I came looking for you. Even I can work that out. I came to offer you a job opportunity. A job? I'm not a doctor. This has nothing to do with medicine. It's a chance to do what you do best. Get into trouble and disappoint my father? Something like that. First, I need a hair of the dog. There's a place on the corner. The owner's a friend of mine. Should be. I keep him in business. He staggered to his feet, got a jacket and hat, and headed for the door. There were market carts jogging towards the bridge, headed for Covent Garden, tangled with the sprawl of hansom cabs and double-decker buses along the Waterloo Road. The air was pungent with smoke from the train station. Outside the Crown, potmen were polishing the huge swinging lamps and plate-glass windows, and barrels of beer were being lowered into dark, yawning cellars from the brewer's dray. A jellied eel cart had set up outside. Breakfast for some. Harry went ahead, pushed through the queue, and headed into the saloon bar. They took a seat in the snug by the window. George got a half-pint of ale. Harry said, "The usual, Bert." The usual turned out to be a double gin. Harry's hands shook as he picked up the glass. He lit a cigarette. "Steady," George said. "Can't start the day without a hearty breakfast," Harry said. He picked up yesterday's copy of the Times, scanned the obituary column. "What are you doing?" George said. "First thing every morning, make sure I'm not listed. Way I feel, can't always be sure." "What have you been doing with yourself since you left the army?" George said. "You know what I've been doing. You don't have to be delicate." "I was told you'd been chasing the bottle. It looks like you caught up with it a few times." "I needed a rest from soldiering." "Is this what you call a rest? You look like you've just crawled out of the sewer." "Thanks." "Well, you told me not to be delicate." "Did Father send you?" "You know better than that." Harry took a swallow of gin. He coughed and clutched at his ribs. "How did you find me?" "I'm still in touch with a lot of the fellows from the old days in Cairo. They love to talk." "I bet they do." "You make a wonderful roomer." "Well, I'm glad you did find me. I owe you a great debt. I think those fellows might have put me in the hospital if you had not appeared." "Let's call it returning a favour. You got me out of countless scrapes at school." "Well, you were younger then, smaller, and you didn't have a cane with a razor blade in the tip." "They should give them to every schoolboy when he starts a new school." "It would solve the bullying problem. Are you back living in Bristol?" George shook his head. He took a sip of his beer and grimaced. Bit early for him. "No, here in London. Looked everywhere for you, then found out we'd only been living a few miles apart." "How's your papa?" "He died last year." "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. He was a good man. There are not many of us left now." George smiled, despite himself. "You may joke about it, but you had more in common with him than you think." "Your father was a sainted man. He and I had nothing in common with each other, and I say that with some regret." "He wasn't as perfect as everyone thinks," George said. "Who is?" Harry caught a glimpse of his own reflection in the mirror above the bar and the shelf of dusty bottles. Wherever you went, there were mirrors. "Do you ever hear anything of Lucy?" "Must we talk about her?" George said. "It is an innocent inquiry, is all." "You know there is no such thing. You mustn't keep tearing the stitches from the wound." "I'm merely curious. It doesn't really bother me anymore." "She caught syphilis from one of the junior officers in the regiment. The general threw her on the street with her baby, and now she sells herself in Piccadilly for 3 shillings a time against the wall. You see, I saw you smile. You're not over it at all." "Do you see my father very much?" Harry asked him. "I called on him when I got out of the army. I thought it was the proper thing." "How is my dearest papa? In good health?" "For his years?" "Did he ask after me?" "Of course he did." "Well, I had to ask. He has 2 sons. It's a lot for him to remember. What did you tell him about me?" "There wasn't much I could tell. I knew of your situation, of course, but I thought it best to be discreet." "My sainted brother, was he there?" "He was at the factory when I called. He works long hours, so your father told me." Harry laughed. "What?" "Sometimes I don't know if I'm jealous of him or if I pity him. I hoped your news of dear Tom would have been different." "Different? What would you have liked me to have said?" "That he had fucked the mayor's wife and lost all my father's money on bad investments and been imprisoned by the government for tax irregularities. Then I should have been pleased. That's not likely, is it? That doesn't mean I don't wish for it from time to time. Still, perhaps working 12 hours a day in my father's office is destiny enough. I should be glad that I avoided it. He simply remains true to his character. Well, that is enough of small talk. Now tell me why the hell you've gone to all this trouble to find me. How would you like to turn things around, Harry? You can if you play your cards right. If I could play my cards right, I wouldn't be in any sort of mess. Come on, no more games. What are you talking about? I've got an offer for you. A chance to make a lot of money very quickly, putting your skills to good use. Someone is going to pay me to drink and lose at cards? Your skills as a gunnery officer are still valuable to certain people. Sorry, I've left the army. But you still know how to command a battery of artillery, don't you? I do, but I don't want to. What would you say if I told you that the Sultan of Morocco needs 2 good men to command his artillery? I would say, how did the Sultan of Morocco come by artillery? They were a gift. Right. So, he needs 2 men to command his new guns. And who is this other officer? Me. You? You don't know one end of a cannon from the other. You were in the medical corps. The Sultan doesn't know this. The deal is this. I go along as your aide-de-camp, wear my old uniform, strut about a bit, and collect my share at the end. For doing what? For getting you the job. So what do I have to do for this? They want 1 year of your life, Harry. That's all. For 1 year, they'll pay you 10 years' wages. The way you live, you'll probably gamble it all away in 6 months, but that's up to you. 10 years' wages. £2,000. Each? Each. That's madness. Who would pay £4,000 for 2 artillery officers? The Sultan of Morocco. Harry let out a sigh and sagged back in his chair. How many guns are we talking about? The Sultan has 3 muzzle-loading cannons. He put 2 Spanish army officers in charge of them, but these gentlemen have apparently disappeared. So he needs 2 experienced officers to take their place. To what purpose? Apparently he needs to put down a few native rebellions in the provinces, and he is willing to pay handsomely for such assistance. You have no idea how rich this man is, Harry. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Wait. Muzzle-loading cannons. They were gifts from the United States government, the sort of equipment that would be unlikely to trouble a modern army, but the Sultan was delighted, they tell me. Muzzle-loaders? They're museum pieces. Probably. Do you know how to fire one? Well, of course I know how. Is that what he wants me to teach his army to do? Fire museum pieces at natives? Do you still have your uniform? In a trunk, somewhere. We should go back and get it. You want me to put it on? Not now. When we reach Marrakesh. It will impress the Sultan. Harry looked into George's simple, honest face. Had he caught a fever in the Far East and gone completely mad? Did he really believe all this nonsense? Where's Marrakesh? It's in the south of the country. How far south? Just north of the Sahara. 2 weeks' ride from Tangier. Perhaps 3. An entire year, then, chasing around the desert. What else will you do with your time, Harry? You have no money, no life. You're living in a flat that stinks of piss and boiled cabbage. You've got rising damp and the walls shake every time the train comes through. You have no prospects. I'm offering you a lifeline here. I'll have to think about this. Take your time. Think about it all you want. George took out his fob watch and flipped open the case with his thumb. There's a boat for Gibraltar leaving Tilbury Docks at 4 o'clock. We have to be on it. You give me no time to reorganize my life. I've seen your life. What is there to organize? You have no job, no wife. You do not even have anything in your larder. Everything you owe you can pack in a suitcase. Do you owe rent? A bit. I'll leave the money with your key on the table as we leave. I've already booked 2 berths on the ship. We'll go back now and pack your things. Then we'll go to my hotel. I'll stitch up your eye and we can catch a cab to the docks. And then what? We catch a ferry to Tangier. The Sultan is sending an escort up from Marrakesh to meet us. We will ride down the coast to Rabat and then head inland to Marrakesh. The Sultan is marching there with his army for the start of his summer campaign." Harry felt the stirrings of panic. Yet this was a way out, as George said. £2,000. He might actually be able to pull his life back together. Only, what was the point? Harry drained his glass and stood up. "It was good to see you again, George." "That's it? You're saying no?" "I appreciate the offer." "You're mad," George said. "What's next? Back to the tables and the bottle?" Harry went to the door, put on his hat. It had a dent in it from the night before. He tried to punch it out. He looked up. It was starting to rain. The sky looked grey and filthy, as if it had been dragged through the mud. The dustmen hadn't been around yet, and there was an old man sorting through the tubs of bar refuse. A gang of urchins, none of them older than 10, was throwing rubbish at him, some bits of broken glass, a cabbage head they'd found in the street. The drunk was cursing at them, but they kept right on at it. Harry went over and chased them off. "What was that about?" he said to the old tramp. He muttered something unintelligible. He looked like he was part blind and all the way crazy. There was vomit or old food in his beard, and he stank like the river at low tide. Harry dug in his pockets and found some coins, pressed them into the man's hand. That was it, all he had. He looked back at the bar. Hell with it. A year chasing around the desert. Not even for £2,000. He stepped onto the road. A trolley bus went past, bells clanging. He felt the rush of air on his face. It missed him, but only by inches. He took a step back, stood there on the pavement, shocked at how close he had come to a sudden, meaningless obliteration. He looked around. No one had seen what had just happened except the old tramp, and he was laughing and slapping his knee as if it was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. When Harry went back into the crown, George was about to leave. They bumped into each other in the doorway. "Changed your mind?" "I don't want to kill anyone," Harry said. "Of course not. I'll teach them how to fire their damned cannons if that's what they want. But I've had enough of butchering." "No killing," George said. "My word on it. This will be the easiest money you've ever made. Like taking sweets from a baby." Chapter 3. Marrakesh, Morocco. Snow-covered peaks pushed their way through a mist of clouds in the far distance. Snow. For Harry, covered in sweat and dust, his mouth gummy with thirst, the moment seemed unreal. "The Atlas Mountains," George said as he rode up beside him. He'd heard of them, of course. The forbidding mountains that stood like a rampart across the Maghreb, separating Morocco from the great deserts of the Sahara and the salt road that led to Timbuktu and the heart of Africa. He'd never thought to ever come back to Africa, see these mountains for himself. "Where's Marrakesh?" he said. "There," George said, and pointed to a thin ochre tower just visible above the groves of feathery palms below them. "That's the Koutoubia Mosque." They had not seen a town of any size since they had left a little fishing village called Casablanca. They had occasionally glimpsed a group of peasants gathered about a well or a white kubba, what the locals called the tomb of one of their countless saints, in the middle of nowhere. There had been a few fondaks, or fortified farms, but most nights they had slept under the stars, two of their escort keeping guard around the campfire. The riders the Sultan had sent to fetch them from Tangier called this vast expanse of saltbush plains the Bled. They saw no towns, no mountains, no great rivers. From time to time they had glimpsed a caravan of mules or camels going the other way. They appeared to float on the shimmering heat haze as if walking on the surface of some great lake. The landscape was familiar to Harry from his time in Egypt, the humbling distances and never-ending sky. He was even accustomed to the hardships of the journey from his soldiering days. What tormented him day and night was the need for a drink. It was like a toothache, an actual physical hurt. Some days it was all he could think about. He'd brought some supplies with him before he left England. He'd had some bottles of Gordon's gin in his luggage, and they might have seen him this far at least, but some porter waller had dropped them on the rock while they were getting ashore in Tangier. Lost the lot. He could have killed the man on the spot. He thought about the old soak sorting through the tubs outside the Crown. That fellow hadn't simply woken up one morning in the gutter. It would have happened to him by degrees, one denial at a time, until one day he was a drunk in rags, urchins throwing garbage at him. George was right, he thought. I got out of London just in time. Below them, the valley stretched away through the heat haze to the foot of the mountains, the vast oasis green with crops and date palms. Tell me it's not another mirage, George. He laughed. No, this is it, Harry. We've arrived. Do you think that mosque down there has a saloon bar? Of course, and a casino with dancing girls. They followed their escort down the scarp. 3 weeks since they had rounded Cape Malabat, and the bad-tempered brute that Harry had been given to ride had made the harrowing journey almost unbearable. Some horses, like some men, were better companions than others. And these Moorish saddles were magnificent to look at, with their embroidered tassels and coloured stitching, but in his estimation they were second only to the rack as a form of torture. The peak, before and behind, kept the rider in the saddle, but was as solid as iron. There were perhaps a dozen layers of felt between the saddle and the poll of the horse. The short stirrup leathers that the Moroccans used made any ride longer than an hour or two a complete agony. He had once ridden a camel through the Algerian desert in far greater comfort. Unfortunately for them, their escort had the idea, as did so many Moors, that a rider should rest as few times in a day as possible. They said that mounting and dismounting tired a horse more than a league of road, so they had not stopped to rest all that morning. It was another hour of riding through the oasis before they reached the walls of the city. They entered through the Bab el-Debar, the gate of the tanneries, and suddenly they were in a different world. The buildings crowded in on every side, and many of the streets were arched with overhanging vines, the trellises so low that they had to bend over in the saddle to get through. The stink was overpowering. Harry pulled his shesh, the Berber headscarf he had taken to wearing, tighter around his face and nose. One moment there was the smell of baking bread or meat roasting over hot coals. The next, he was assailed by the stench of piss and ordure so overpowering he thought even his horse might object. It was nothing as he had imagined. The alleys were narrower and more tortuous than anything he had seen in Tangier. The people were mostly dressed in rags. There were milk-eyed beggars with running sores and men without arms or legs huddled in the doorways of dilapidated mosques, moaning for alms. Inside the doors he caught a brief glimpse of the worshippers, seated on the floor in rows for their midday prayers. Dirt-crusted urchins went ducking and weaving through the crowds. It was worse than anything he'd seen in Cairo. There were camels, carpets, skinned sheep hanging from hooks. Madmen, with their eyes rolling in their heads, wandered among the crowds beside women covered head to foot in black chadar, so that all that was visible was their eyes. There were fat merchants in tarbouches and jalabas, slave traders leading lines of black slaves, stinking of sweat and misery, chained at their hands and feet, their heads down, faces blank with despair. A group of hawk-nosed tribesmen in filthy sheepskins stared at Harry as he rode past, fingering the ancient swords they wore tucked into their belts. Every one of them looked as if he would like to cut out his liver. "It seems they don't like unbelievers in this place," Harry said. "Is that why they looked at you like that?" George shouted back. "I thought it was because you owed them money." A string of camels bullied their way through, jamming them against the walls. Not a thing even the Sultan's escort could do about it. They were shepherded through a warren of dusty yellow alleys and crumbling hovels and gloomy bazaars with tiny box-like shops. Their horses were jostled on every side by the crush of mules and carts. The Sultan's riders tried to clear a path, shouting at anyone too slow to move, sometimes using long canes to whip people out of their way. It was a rude shock after their 3 long weeks of solitude, an assault on all the senses. And the noise. After so many days and weeks of the rush of the wind and clip of horses' hooves, the noise made Harry recoil. Everyone in the city seemed to be roaring and haggling and screeching at one another. At last they came out on a wide square under the tower of the Kutubia. One of their escort told them it was called the Gemma el-Fna, the place of the dead. It was clear that this wasn't another Arab city like Tangier. He saw a few bearded sharifs riding mules, but most of the faces in the crowds belonged to wild Berber mountain men, or Sudanese with their smooth, sweat-shining faces, some pure-blood Africans from the Draa and the Souss. "Looks like an excellent place to get your pocket picked," George said. "Or to catch every kind of pox," Harry said. "You'd know more about that than me." Village women squatted on mats in the dirt, next to pyramids of purple eggplants, branches of golden dates, bright green watermelons, orange pumpkins, stacks of flat bread, or rough bags of thistles, fodder for the mules and donkeys. Half-naked water carriers, dressed in goatskins with strings of brass bottles around their necks, wandered through the crowds, crying, "Alma! Alma!" Camels lurched about, having wandered off from their owners, foraging for themselves in the dust. Around the edges of the square, there were a few wooden sheds where merchants hawked waistcoats and kaftans in gaudy colours. Some people were crouched in a circle around a storyteller. A little further on, they passed another crowd staring at a performing ape on a long chain. It was dressed in a red tunic and wearing a tarbouche. Harry thought about the organ grinder in Lambeth, with his little capuchin performing on the end of its string. Whatever way you looked at it, the entertainment business wasn't kind to monkeys. From somewhere he heard the sound of tom-toms, and a Moorish flute played very badly. But it seemed to delight his horse. It raised its head and stepped sideways as if it were dancing in time with the music. It was the first time it had shown any sign of a more pleasing disposition. The musicians seemed to be in the employ of a snake charmer. They stood behind him, making up for, in noise, what they lacked in technique. As they rode past, Harry saw the man produce a snake from his basket, making a horrified face as if he really believed the poor creature might actually bite him. He reined in his horse to watch. The serpent he knew from his time in Egypt was a common African house snake, no more dangerous than a 3-day-old kitten. But the man was putting on a real show, shaking violently as he danced around the crowd, groaning and crying as if he was in actual fear of his life. Suddenly, he put out his tongue and let the snake fix its fangs into it, and he ran towards Harry, the snake dangling from his mouth while his spectators gasped and backed away. Harry felt in his pockets. All he had was a penny. He tossed it to him. "Next time you're in the Crown in Lambeth, get yourself a quart of gin." One of the musicians broke away from the rest of his little orchestra and started to go round the crowd, collecting coppers in his tambourine as the charmer brought a cobra from its basket, holding it carefully by the neck while he showed it to the bystanders, letting them admire its fangs. No doubt he had milked off its venom first. Harry had taken Lucy to witness such a performance in Alexandria, and she had squealed and called the snake charmer unladylike names when he thrust a serpent in her face. "Harry!" He turned around. George and their escort were waiting for him. "What's the rush? We're here now." "I can't lose you. You're the only one who knows how to fire a cannon." As they left the square, an air of desolation descended over the city. Many of the mud-brick buildings were in ruin. It was like a city that had been sacked by invaders and had never quite recovered. There were large tracts of dirt and rubble filled with offal and refuse, the precinct of snarling, cadaverous yellow dogs, wild as jackals. There was sand everywhere, in the lanes, blowing in drifts over the ruins of mosques and long deserted hovels. It grew unbearably hot as the sun rose to its zenith, and within an hour of entering the city they were covered in the grime and dust thrown up by their horses' hooves. Everything seemed to be the same gloomy, dun-grey colour. A city, as George muttered to him, that looked as if it had been built from dried camel dung. And then, turning a corner, they came upon a stunningly beautiful fountain, decorated in vivid green tiles, fit for a sultan's palace. The fountain had inscribed on it, "Shrab Ushuf." The Arabic he had learned while on service in Algiers had come back to him during their journey from the coast, and he read, "Drink and admire." Finally, they emerged into the richer quarter, with dusty open spaces and walled gardens. He made out the tops of palm, olive, and orange trees, and the slender green stems of cypress. The walls of the Kasbah rose ahead of them. They rode through a stone gateway into a massive square and were greeted with a blast of trumpets. The great wooden doors slammed shut on the hellish vision outside, and they found themselves in a paradise of flowers and fountains and sudden, shocking silence. Their escort led them through a gateway into another court, with a mosque on one side. They followed a long, straight road, past the soldiers' quarters, and finally reached what they were told was the Sultan's palace. Palace was perhaps the wrong word, Harry thought. He'd expected something more imposing, on a grand scale like Versailles, perhaps. Instead, there was a number of pavilions and kiosks faced with Moorish arches, scattered among a vast and rambling garden of orange and lemon groves. There were pointed roofs of glazed green tiles, the golden globes on the top of each one gleaming in the sun. George pointed out the Sultan's green flag flying from the tower. "It seems we have arrived," he said. "Hopefully they will bring us water." "A glass of gin would be even more welcome," Harry said. Sand crunched between his teeth. It was everywhere, in his hair, in his clothes, under his fingernails. They drew up their horses under an orange tree. George closed his eyes for a moment in the cool shade and breathed in the scent of the blossoms. "I feel the worst of it is over." "Thank God," Harry said. Their four-man escort wheeled away and left them. 3 weeks they had spent in their company, and still they didn't even know their names. "Not even a fond goodbye," Harry said. "And they've been such charming companions." He rocked in the saddle. He would have happily tumbled onto the ground and curled up there. He just wanted to sleep. "I swear 2 of my cheeks are raw from the sun, and the other 2 feel like they are welded to the saddle." George swung gingerly down from his horse, and Harry did the same. He uttered a grunt of sheer relief. His breeches felt like sandpaper. It hurt even to walk. There were guard tents dotted about the courtyard among the orange and olive trees. Negroes in red tarbushes and white kaftans sat about drinking tea, playing cards, and paying them not the slightest attention. "The Bokhara, I believe," George said. "The Black Guard, the Sultan's hand-picked men. Perhaps you can teach them to play baccarat. You might win some money." "More likely I'll lose it, if I had any to spend." An iron-barred gate swung open, and a man appeared, crossed the court toward them with the curiously waddling gait of the obscenely fat. He looked more like a corpulent Irishman than an Arab, Harry thought, with his red beard and pale skin. He wore a snow-white haik over an emerald-green kaftan, and there was a ruby the size of a billiard ball in the middle of his turban. He had with him an escort of soldiery in white gowns and turbans and curved swords. "The welcoming party," George said. "Looks more like the food taster for the entire army." "Not so loud. He speaks English." They made the customary welcome, placing their right hand on their hearts, followed by a swishing, open gesture. "Assalamu alaikum." peace be upon you." The vizier returned the gesture, carefully avoiding the word alaikum. After all, a good Muslim would never wish peace on a dog of a Christian. His name, he said, was Hajj Hamad al-Mansur, chief vizier to the Sultan. He made a short, welcoming speech. Harry didn't catch it all. His Arabic was still a little rusty. It seemed they were to be directed to rooms in the palace and had been offered a change of clothes and a bath. The formalities complete, the vizier went back inside with his retinue. They were left in the care of 2 black slaves, who ushered them into an inner courtyard, then led them up some narrow stairs to their rooms. Their quarters were palatial, at least. They each had their own bedroom, with an enormous salon in between that looked out over the flower gardens. It was blessedly cool after the furnace heat of the city. The air was ripe with orange blossom and jasmine, and remarkably tranquil. The only sounds were the bubbling of a fountain and the screech of a peacock as it rustled its feathers in the marble-flagged courtyard below. "Look at this," George said, turning in a circle, looking at the fretted panels of cedar, the shining marble floors, the bronze doors with their ornate bosses, the arabesque ceramics of interwoven geometric design on the walls. The salon even had the intricately decorated ceilings that the Moors called muqarnas, a honeycombing effect quite unlike anything Harry had ever seen before. "It will do, I suppose," Harry said. "Not quite the style I'm accustomed to." He walked into his bedroom. They'd laid out some clothes for him on the bed, a linen shirt, a smock, loose white cotton trousers. "Are we going native?" he called out to George. "You told me to bring my dress blues." George leaned in the doorway. "I suppose these are for comfort around the palace." The doors flew open, and 2 slaves entered carrying silver trays with honey cakes and melon. Another one came in with a silver pot and 2 glasses filled with tea and mint leaves. They went out onto the balcony. Some pigeons cooed around the deep baths and pools. Other arcaded apartments, like theirs, looked over the shadowed cypress trees and tunnels of jasmine flowers. It was a languid world of greenery, water pools, and swooping swallows. Hard to believe that on the other side of the walls there were beggars with no feet pleading for alms in the filthy alleys, Negro slaves in steel chains being herded behind strings of camels. "Well, this will do for a few weeks," Harry said. "In fact, I might get to like it. No offense, but a few times on the ride down from Tangier, I was ready to murder you." "I told you, money for old rope." "I think my arse is about to drop off. How long do you think we'll be here?" "A few weeks, at least. They have to give us time to train up the artillery." An hour ago, Harry had thought he would sleep for a week. Now, a bath and a good stiff drink, and he might begin to feel like himself again. They explored the corridors, found a stairway that led up to the roof. The city lay stretched in front of them, like a vast nomad camp, a shabby oasis surrounded by a green belt of palm trees and featureless scrubland. The noise of the great market square rose, sometimes loud, sometimes faint, changing with the strength of the breeze. It was not a city you could wander, he thought. There were drifts of sand on every corner. You would need a mule just to reach the Medina. In fact, there was nothing remarkable at all about it, except for the startling dark red minaret at its center. No matter where he looked, his eye was always drawn back to the Kutubia, the only stone building in this ruinous desert heap of dried mud and sand. Just below the parapet was a band of black and green iridescent tiles. It appeared as if there had once been tilework in all the many niches on the face of the tower, but most of these had crumbled away with time. On the summit were 3 metal globes, arranged one above the other and decreasing in size, glowing golden in the setting sun. "This is nothing like I imagined," Harry said. "You expected Cairo?" He lit a cheroot. "Well, not pyramids, but something grander than this. Look at it. Sand everywhere, even in the streets." The sun started to sink down the sky. the palms and minarets throwing long and deep shadows. The glittering snow peaks of the high Atlas turned pink, then mauve. And as it dipped below the horizon, the first of the mueddin began his plaintive call to prayer, followed by the wailing of another, then another, until the city echoed with 2 dozen voices, chanting their ancient song from the parapets of 12 mosques. When the last strains died away, there was a shockingly brief twilight, and then the city and the valley fell to a profound silence. In London, he thought, I would just be getting started. There were days when I was only now risen from my bed. George pointed towards the mountains, now fading into the dark. That is where we're headed, the Atlas Mountains. They're ruled by warlords. They call them qaids. They pay nominal fealty to the Sultan, depending on their mood. On the other side of the mountain is the Sahara, and that's part of Morocco too, but it's quite lawless. What about the rebellion? All I know is that the rebel chief is a man called Bu Hamra. He's hiding in a fortress up there somewhere. Our job is to blast him out. Harry shook his head. Never thought I'd find myself in uniform again. Life is full of surprises. I hope there aren't any surprises on this commission. All I want is to get my money and go home. George slapped Harry on the shoulder. You look all in. Too much debauched living. You're out of shape. You can't have too much debauchery, George. Only not enough. He stubbed out his cheroot, put the stub back in the tin for later. I'm going to kick off my boots and sleep for a week. You don't think our vizier friend could get me a bottle of brandy? Medicinal purposes. It's a Muslim country. You'll have to make do with mint tea. Harry went back down to his room, to silk coverlets, soft pillows, and gentle breezes cooled by the murmuring fountains below. He was asleep before he had even got his boots off. He woke about an hour later to the sound of a pitched battle. It was dark, and he couldn't remember where he was. He staggered out of bed, realized he only had one boot on. A massive explosion briefly illuminated the room, and he saw his other boot lying on the carpets. He sat down and worked it back on. He still felt foggy from sleep. Morocco. I'm in Morocco. He went looking for George. There was another crash, followed by a shower of sparks. Perhaps it's the rebels, he thought. A preemptive attack on the city. George! He wasn't in his bed. George, where the hell are you? The corridor outside was lit by gas lamps. He followed it until he found the stairs to the roof. He saw a familiar silhouette leaning on the parapet and the glow of a cigarette. George, what's happening? So, you're awake. When I got up, you were snoring fit to wake the dead. I thought you were going to miss the show. The sky was ablaze with the colourful explosion of rockets. Reds, silvers, golds, greens. The smell of gunpowder carried on the hot summer breeze. It reminded him of other nights in Egypt, whole towns and villages aflame. What's going on? You still think we're overpaid? Imagine what this little display costs. And they say he does this 3 or 4 times every week. Fireworks, Harry said. His latest craze. He has them shipped to Tangier, then hauled down here on a camel all the way from the coast. Must have cost a king's ransom. Plus there's insurance to cover the freight, and every step of the way someone adds their commission. Believe me, our wages are nothing compared to what he spends on all his little fancies. Another crack, like a rifle volley, as a wall of Catherine wheels exploded into flame, a waterfall of fire in various shades of pink and green. Haj Hamad was up here earlier. He told me that they brought an expert from England to stage these little shows. The Sultan has made him a permanent member of his court. After the Catherine wheels, there was another crack of rockets, dozens of them, one after another, trailing coloured sparks over the clustered flat roofs and the brooding tower of the old mosque. The night's grand finale. There was an eerie silence when it was over. Harry could hear the shouts and screams from the crowd in the great square, the glow of torches, the drift of the smoke across the crescent moon. "I wonder what the people here think of it," George said. "One rocket would feed a family for a month. It's an outrage, don't you think so?" "It's just fireworks, George." Harry lit the stub of the cheroot he had saved from that afternoon. "All these beggars in the street, and he wastes his money on firecrackers." "You're a better man than me. Here I am living in a palace. There are slaves bringing me dates and watermelon, and if I had a bottle of Gordon's, I wouldn't give the poor a second thought." "That's not true." "I think you overestimate me." Harry watched the smoke from the fireworks drift across the shallow moon. "How long did you say we'll be able to rest up here? A few weeks? Was that what you said?" "Something like that. Well, maybe not a few weeks, exactly." George seemed vague about it. "Didn't you ask this Hajj Hamad?" "You know what these fellas are like," George said. "They only tell you what they want you to know." "A bit like you, George." "What do you mean by that?" "I mean, you would probably be a better gambler than me. You know how to keep your cards close to your chest. For example, you never told me how you found out about this commission. You left the army a long time ago." "Do you remember Peterson?" "Should I?" "We all graduated from Sandhurst at the same time." "Wait a minute. The weedy-looking fellow with the moustache that looked like an albino caterpillar?" "He's a major now." "Well, that's the army for you." "I bumped into him one day, in the Strand. We went for a drink, and he told me he'd been on secondment with our consulate in Tangier. He was the one who told me the Sultan was looking for retired artillerymen, asked me if I knew anyone that was interested. I said I would act as a sort of intermediary and give him a percentage." "Wait a minute. You never told me anything about percentages. Do I have to give him part of my £2,000? "No, of course not. You're doing all the work. I'll take care of Peterson's share." "Right." Harry ground his cheroot out under his heel. "But why did you pick me, George?" "The truth?" "Well, all right then, but sugar-coat it first." "There wasn't much choice. Most of the fellows from our regiment are either still in the army or have got themselves jobs, families. They have too much to lose." "So I'm the only one who's basically wasted his life and has nothing more to lose." "Is that sugar-coated enough?" The hubbub from the Jama el-Fna had died down, and the ancient city settled again to silence. "I'm going back to bed," George said. He turned for the stairs, hesitated. "You know, this might be what you need. To turn things around, I mean." "Are you trying to save me, George? Is that it? Am I a charity project, saving up your good works for heaven?" "Well, why not?" "Forget it. In the end, we are what we are. Still, I'm grateful for you showing up that night, and I'll be glad of the £2,000, if we get it." "Good night, Harry." As Harry watched George disappear down the stairs, he felt a wave of gratitude. It was good of him, even if he did sound like his old Sunday school teacher sometimes. He didn't want to let the man down. It wouldn't be as easy as George thought for him to hold his end up. He looked down. His hands were shaking. He could feel the sweat coming on. That was the trouble with Africa. Not a drop of good liquor to be had anywhere, even in a palace. He heard someone coming up the stairs. He thought it was George coming back. "Don't tell me you found me a bottle of brandy." "I am afraid not," a high-pitched voice said in perfect English. "These Moors, they don't know how to enjoy themselves." He got to his feet. He couldn't see the man's face, but he knew by the size of him that it must be the vizier, Hajj Hamad. "Sorry, meant no offence," Harry said. "There is none taken. Although the Koran prohibits the drinking of strong liquor, I have been known to partake of a little myself when I travel to a Christian country, to grease the diplomatic wheels. You enjoyed His Majesty's display of fireworks?" "You speak good English." "Thank you. I can speak French quite well also, and your friend says you have some Arabic." "I'm a little rusty. I was posted to Cairo for several years. I picked it up then. Cairo, yes. Your colleague informs me that you were in the British Army there. Yes. He also tells me that you are a highly decorated soldier. They gave me a medal once. It was nothing. Rush of blood. I'm not a particularly brave man. Well, bravery can be overrated. Most brave men of my acquaintance died young. I, however, am still here. Alive and eating well, Harry thought. You were a captain in the artillery? Is there anything he didn't tell you? Yes. He didn't tell me why they stripped you of your medals and sent you home in disgrace. Harry didn't answer, and Haj Hamad gave a small but apologetic laugh. You must excuse me. You must understand an employer doesn't hire a man he knows nothing about. I made some inquiries of my own. I wasn't sent home in disgrace. I resigned my commission. And why did you do that? I was ordered to. Ah. There was a problem between me and a certain general of our army. What sort of problem? The sort of problem that required me to leave. Haj Hamad waited for Harry to elaborate. When he didn't, he said, Your colleague has told you why Sidna, our Sultan, has hired your services? He said that you wished us to help you put down a rebellion. Yes. Unfortunately, there are always rebellions. It is a large country and almost impossible to administer. The people object to paying taxes, and we object to not receiving them. It causes tension. So, the Sultan is required to take his army into the more distant parts of his dominions every 2 or 3 years to impose order. But this year, the need for our intervention is far more urgent. There is a usurper. Boo Hamra, Harry said. Yes. How much did your friend tell you about him? Very little. Boo Hamra has attracted quite a large following. He has great charisma and dazzles his followers with a few cheap magic tricks. He is like a magician. He pulls rabbits out of hats. Instead of pulling rabbits from hats, as you say, he raises the dead from the grave. Or, so they say. He also claims to be a direct descendant of the Prophet. Doesn't everyone? Haj Hamad laughed. A good point, but we should take care not to blaspheme. The point is, this man has gathered many followers, and the problem must be excised at its root. Or blown apart with the 3 new cannons you have acquired. Precisely. They are truly beautiful weapons. You will gasp when you see them. Gasping costs extra. Where did you get them? They were a gift from the ambassador of the United States in Tangier. And these Spanish artillerymen who preceded us, they have already trained some men for the gun crews? Of course. And they eagerly await your arrival. They are already quite proficient. I think you will be surprised. If they know one end from the other, I will be amazed. What happened to the 2 Spanish gentlemen who preceded us? They are no longer in our employ, Haj Hamad said, waving a hand airily in the air. Well, I wish you good night now. I hope you find your quarters to your satisfaction. If only you knew, Harry thought. They are adequate. I'm pleased to hear it. Enjoy your rest. Harry stayed on the roof for a while longer, lit another cheroot. This was the time of day he hated most, when he was alone with his thoughts, had nothing to keep him company but his dreams and the whisperings of his soul. He often wondered how contented men spent their nights. It must be pleasant to be untroubled by your own mind. He closed his eyes and thought about the dusty rows of gin bottles on their glass shelf in the saloon bar of the Crown. For a long time now, it had been the only way he could get to sleep. Without a good stiff drink, the nights were endless, spent rummaging around in his interminable thoughts, trying to find something of comfort or value. There must be something in the world worth caring about. He only wished he knew what it was.